So, welcome everyone to this open lecture by Nätverket för psykedelisk vetenskap. My name is Philip Bromberg and I am the chairman of Nätverket. We have about 2 hours here together today with Dr. Elizabeth Nielson for a lecture about psilocybin-assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder. Elizabeth will be speaking for roughly 60 minutes, and then there will be some time for questions from the audience, and I will be running around with a microphone. So if you have any questions during the lecture, please save them for afterwards. I also want to mention that after this event, we have the opportunity to move on to a nearby bar for what we call a Psychedelic Pub Event. It's something that we do every now and then. I realize the irony, but there are lovely alcohol-free options as well. The event will be at a cocktail bar called 2005 in Sankt Eriksgatan, so walking distance. So, Dr. Elizabeth Nielson is a psychologist at New York University, where she has been involved as a therapist on the phase 2 trials for psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder. She has also been a therapist in the MAPS phase 2 and 3 studies for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. She also runs a private practice in New York, which she will say more about in just a moment. We're really happy to have you here, Elizabeth. Please take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Let's see. So this is actually my second trip to Sweden, and the first one was in October for the conference that the Swedish network organized. Was anybody there? Anybody else there? All right. So we've got some converts here, right? If you were there, I mean, it was really one of the nicest arrangements I've ever been to. So I'm very grateful to the Swedish Network for Psychedelic Science, Philip, and everybody else who's been involved in that for their support, not just to me for getting here and being able to do something like this, but to the whole community of psychedelic researchers and those of us that are working in the field. It's really wonderful to be able to do a lecture like this that's free, open to the public, and is accessible for anybody who wants to come. So my second thank you goes to extend to the audience, to everybody who came out today on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of winter. I hear it's a holiday or there's some kind of sports going on. You could all be doing other things. So thank you for coming and joining us here. I will expand a little bit on my roles. So back in New York, I'm a psychologist at NYU School of Medicine. The group that I work with specifically is called the Experimental Therapeutics Research Laboratory, and that's really a mouthful, but it's a group that includes studies of psilocybin, CBD, and there was some ketamine work done in the past. So there are several kinds of substances, drugs, that are related, and the work is related, and a group of mixed people that work on usually several of these projects at the time. I only work on the psilocybin project and the MDMA projects, but that's why we have that particular title. Our work is actually done at Bellevue Hospital, which is the oldest public hospital in the United States. So we're 400 years old, and it's staffed by NYU doctors, so we are actually housed there. Bellevue is kind of famous for its mental health treatment program, so there's inpatient mental health, outpatient, drug treatment, all of that stuff goes on under one roof. It's a really, really big hospital campus. Some of my other work is done with MAPS, both at NYU and at a private practice site. So I'm a therapist working on MDMA-assisted treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. For those who are familiar with MAPS and their work, they've received breakthrough status for MDMA-assisted treatment of PTSD from the FDA, our regulating agency in the United States. And that work is going ahead. I've actually started working with my first phase 3 trial case just a couple of weeks ago. So that's very exciting to be involved with. And outside of there, I work with a group private practice where we do both clinical work and training and education for clinicians. And all of that centers around helping people who have had experiences with psychedelics in other settings, maybe in a treatment setting, like as part of a study, or maybe in a ritual setting, or maybe in more of a recreational setting, or in whatever setting that these experiences have happened. We're working to really make those a viable and potential topic that can be addressed in psychotherapy. So we do that work ourselves, and we train other clinicians to do that. And I think there's some talk of maybe being able to do a training like that here one day, so stay tuned for that. I would like to, before I continue to just talk about myself ad nauseum, I want to know who is here in the audience. So would it be all right, thank you, dear. Would it be all right to ask how many people in this audience are students of some kind? All right, look at that, aspiring to something. And how many people are like a licensed clinician of some kind? Psychologist, medical, all right, great. How many psychologists do we have? I just have to know, because that's my field, great. And how many people are psychiatrists? We have a couple psychiatrists? Great, excellent. Some of the history of psychedelics in medicine has really been, I think, omitted from from what people going to school when I went to school were taught. I went to school for psychology for way too many years, and the stuff that I'm talking about today, the history that I'm going to touch on, was not part of my formal education. I learned about it on my own. I learned about it from other sources. But it wasn't really included in our curriculums. So that's what I like to know. And if some of this stuff seems foreign to you, or like, why didn't I ever hear that in school? That's a really great question for your department. And because of where I come from, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the history of psychedelic research in the Americas. There has been plenty as well in Europe, but we'll be a little bit focused there because that's where most of the justification for our current work draws from. All right? Great. So let's see. Advance. Oh, that one. Okay, a couple of thanks again. Hefter Research Institute is the funder of the trials that I'm going to be talking about, the Psychedelic Network, and of course, the Institute here for having us in their space. Very nice of everyone to make this happen. What I'll talk about today is I'm going to start with a history a bit about classic psychedelics for alcohol use and like where the justification to do something like this comes from. We didn't just sort of make it up and put these two random things together. There's some history to that. I'm going to talk about the current program of research for psilocybin-assisted treatment. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you some participant perspective. So I'm going to be drawing on some qualitative research that I've done, really seeing how people describe these experiences. I'll talk about the future. I could talk about it in general, but probably related to the rest of my talk would be good. And then we're going to hear from you, and I will answer as many of your questions as I can, as best as I can, and we'll have some discussion afterward. All right? So, a little bit of history. Oh, that's not what I want. Okay. Psilocybin for alcohol use disorder. Where did we get to putting these things together? Psilocybin is one of what we would call the classic hallucinogens or serotonergic hallucinogens. They're a group of psychedelic compounds that chemically look very similar and chemically look very similar to serotonin. That's where they get that name. This category includes LSD and DMT, and all of these act in some way on the 5-HT2A serotonin receptors. There are several categories of serotonin receptors there. That's where they're acting. They all have somewhat similar subjective effects. They vary in terms of intensity, duration, side effects, onset, half-life, things like that. But they're experientially similar, okay, and chemically similar, and the way that they can be used and the types of things that they can be used for may also be similar. So, why psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol use? Going back to LSD, sort of the prototypical psychedelic, king of psychedelics, discovered in 1938. Initially, in the 1950s, Sandoz began distributing LSD. They didn't really know what to do with it. They knew it was really powerful, and they knew it had these very, very dramatic effects. So researchers were experimenting on each other and on people that would come into the lab just to research what it did. But pretty much in the 1950s, anybody who was a university researcher around the world wanted to do some research with this. They could, get some university letterhead and write Sandoz a letter and say, "Hey, I want to do some research. Can you send me some LSD?" And a box of it would come in the mail. It doesn't work like that anymore. But we see that they initially on their packaging said, here's what we think it might be useful for, exploring the nature of psychosis and as an adjunct to psychotherapy. Now, when they said exploring the nature of psychosis, they actually meant for clinicians, especially psychiatrists, people in the medical field, but clinicians in general, people who were working with any kind of psychiatric patient or anybody who was suffering from psychosis. They meant for people to take it themselves to get an experience of what that might be like. So that was part of the history. That was one of the original ideas. And that grew out of needing to do that or the idea that it was necessary to do that to understand the effects. They were very hard to quantify. There wasn't a lot of research on it at that point, and so that was one of the initial indications. That is not something we are currently doing, but I can get back to that later if you're interested in how that kind of fits into our current model. The idea to use LSD as treatment for alcohol use disorder, alcoholism, came out of a group working in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is like in the middle of Canada. And it's a pretty far distanced place from major metropolises and major intellectual centers, but in the 1950s there was a real movement in that area to make better medical care, especially better psychiatric care, better treatment of addictions. It was a very progressive government, a very progressive time. There was a lot of investment in mental health care. So a couple of researchers were working there, and they started thinking, like, what could we use LSD for? They started working with LSD for schizophrenia, and in 1953 they began to use LSD to treat alcoholism. The initial idea was that they could recreate a delirium tremens-like experience such that people would feel so terrified and so distressed that they would stop drinking. That wasn't really what people reported. So they tried that several times, and people were actually reporting things like that they, felt more interconnectedness and more positive emotion and had very positive experiences, and those were motivating them to stop drinking. And so the model shifted a little bit in that direction, but the original idea was to sort of recreate a delirium tremens in people who were maybe earlier in the stages of losing their health and all things related to their life due to the alcoholism, right? So they thought they'd be able to catch people earlier. Hoffer Osmond, part of that group, was also famous for having given mescaline to Aldous Huxley, which resulted in the book The Doors of Perception. And he's the one who actually came up with the word psychedelic. He was trying to find a word that could be neutral and describe the effects of this family of substances that doesn't necessarily have chemical similarity, but has a subjective effect similarity. So there's a little bit of history. Another major center for research, and probably following the Saskatchewan group, the sort of largest and most prominent research group for LSD, especially around alcohol use, was Spring Grove, Maryland State Psychiatric Institute. They had a big program of LSD research. It was, featured on the evening news. It was well documented. It was hundreds of patients going through there. and multiple studies and publications, and their work actually continued until the 1970s. So starting around 1966 through about 1970, restrictions were growing and becoming more and more stringent. It was becoming harder and harder to get LSD for research. It was becoming harder and harder to get approval to do LSD research. But around about 1970, new approvals stopped, but the work that was going on at Spring Grove, they had so many studies going, and they had supplies of LSD, and they kept going until somewhere in the mid-70s for several years, without starting any new studies, but just continuing the work that was going on. And you'll see some of the, I'll point out some papers I'm going to refer to later that came out of there. So essentially, 1950s through around early 1970s, this large group of studies were done, but there was a lot of argument about whether or not this was effective or helpful, and it seemed to depend on who was doing the research and how it was designed, what kind of psychosocial support there was, maybe even what kind of personal experience with LSD the researchers themselves had. It was definitely cited as both a potential confound and a potentially necessary training experience. But a couple years ago, 2012, two researchers, Terry Krebs and Johansson, pulled together all the studies that they could find from that time period on LSD for alcohol use disorder. This is a huge meta-analysis, and they were able to come up with 6 that were actually sort of good enough randomized controlled trials where there was a control group, there was follow-up, there were actual standardized measures done. The researchers described like the population well enough that they could pool the numbers of people that participated in these studies and come up with hopefully a stronger signal of whether or not this might be helpful than each individual study could have done. The studies vary a lot. The doses vary significantly between 210 and 800 micrograms of LSD, which, if you're familiar with dosing, that's quite a substantial amount. Even like your average recreational dose is probably about 100 micrograms. So those are pretty far up there doses. And there was a lot of variation. Some people were, some people were basically just brought in and into a hospital and told we're going to give you an experimental drug and here you go. And others had preparation, psychoeducation, and support going on around it. But that's what they came up with. And the results were pretty promising. So they had a total group of 325 patients getting LSD, a pooled control group of 211 people. And the odds were almost 2 to 1 in favor of LSD. It had an odds ratio of 1.69. So again, a substantial amount of improvement to say, okay, maybe this looks like there's something going on here. All of the studies these randomized controlled trials did show improvement, and that's where it averaged out just below a 2 to 1 odds. The number needed to treat was about 6 to 7 for drinking outcomes in the post-treatment follow-up. Now that's important, but it's even more important when we put it in context with the other kinds of medication-assisted treatment that are out there for alcohol use disorder. So again, this is from the same paper. They looked at the number needed to treat for LSD versus naltrexone, acamprosate, and disulfiram. And this is a lot of numbers on one slide, but just to point out a couple of places. For instance, if you're looking at the number needed to treat. Number needed to treat is the number of patients you need to treat in order to prevent one additional bad outcome. So the bad outcome in this case, in the first line, it's defined as versus return to heavy drinking, and in the second line, it's defined as versus return to any drinking. And you're seeing basically that the number needed to treat with LSD versus all the other ones is lower, if not substantially lower, right? So the lower the number needed to treat, the better you're doing. Ideally, you would have a number of 1, right? Like everybody who gets the treatment does better. You treat one person and you've avoided, you've 100% avoided a negative outcome, right? Unlikely that anything is going to be like that, but these are pretty good numbers, so pretty low and pretty substantially low, all right? So again, this is a signal that things are going in the right direction, and that this type of treatment may be somewhere in the ballpark of or better than the treatments that we do have currently on the market, currently approved. Another line of reasoning that leads us to think that maybe psilocybin could be helpful is that research on related compounds that are used in ritual settings that lend support to the idea that a serotonergic hallucinogen could actually have a positive impact on addiction. So for example, ayahuasca is a tea made in the Amazon, and it contains 2 plants, one of which contains DMT, right, another serotonergic hallucinogen, and the other one of which contains an MAOI, a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which makes the DMT orally active. If you just eat a plant that has DMT in it or take some straight DMT, it's not going to work because the monoamine oxidase in the digestive system is going to break it down before it can get to your brain. Mixing it with the MAOI prevents that process from happening, so it becomes orally active, longer lasting, and sort of a different response curve than DMT if it's either smoked or injected, which is the only way to ingest it purely. Like LSD and psilocybin, it's serotonergic neurotransmitters that it's interacting with. So let's take a look at why we might think that's helpful. Some research done with the addiction severity index. This research was done in Brazil. They looked at addictive drug use among people who drank ayahuasca both in jungle settings and in urban settings. They looked at people who were drinking ayahuasca currently for their study and then did a 1-year follow-up. But they also did follow back with those people, so they asked them about their drug use history and compared the drug use history to the current and then the follow-up time points, right? So it's self-report, it's self-selection. This isn't a randomized controlled trial, but are we seeing a signal that this could have a positive impact on addictive behaviors? Yes, definitely. The comparison between the current drug use and the historical drug use was positive in both groups versus the control group, because they actually used a matched control group. And those improvements were sustained in the group that was based in the jungle. It was not so well sustained in the group that was based in the urban setting. Again, not really able to tell why, because it's not a randomized controlled trial. There could be many other factors. Self-selecting, it could be just that the people that chose to join the more jungle-style community were more likely to maintain those gains anyway, and that's why they ended up there. But again, a good, strong signal for another drug in this class to have a positive effect. All right. So let's look at the current research. Why on earth, if we have research on LSD from the 1960s, are we now working with psilocybin? Does this make sense? Yes, it does. Couple of reasons I'm going to go through. First of all, LSD has it's got a big name, right? Those are big letters. It's got a big reputation. And psilocybin is lesser known, not as notorious, and a lot easier for people to find acceptable as part of something that's going to be part of their university, part of their on their CV, right? These things are slowly changing, and we notice them slowly changing in our at least in my work environment. But you know, for a long time, getting involved in psychedelic research, or especially LSD research, was considered a fairly risky thing to do with your career. So working with a drug that's got fewer associations was actually a lot easier for people to get approvals and buy-in from the larger community. And keep in mind, all of the research that we're doing, this is funded by and large by donations. So people have to be willing to actually put up their own money for these things to happen. It also lasts only about 6 hours as opposed to 10 to 12. Doing this kind of work in an institution, you've got a lot of scheduling, you've got a lot of staffing issues, you may need to have a medical person on call, there need to be several staff people there for the duration of the session. So it's a lot easier to do that if you can fit it into a regular business day, 8 hours, 9 hours, as opposed to having to schedule 12-hour sessions, people have to overtime, it gets really complicated. So it's a feasibility thing. It does seem to have an easier to deal with side effect profile, that kind of thing, but I will clarify that we do not actually give people mushrooms. The psilocybin in the studies is all synthetic. And the reason for that is purity. It has to be tested, it has to be pure, it has to be stable, it has to be encapsulated, it has to be weighed. In the study that I worked on, it's weighed for each person, so the dosing is by weight. A couple of years ago, Michael Bogenschutz, who's now the PI at NYU that I'm going to be talking about the phase 2 trial of, he did a psilocybin-assisted treatment of alcohol study, alcohol dependence studies, a proof of concept study or a pilot study. This was done at University of New Mexico, and it was a single group, 10 people, and everybody got psilocybin in the context of 12 weeks of psychotherapy. So 12 weeks of psychotherapy, regular psychotherapy with 2 therapists, and 2 psilocybin sessions at weeks 4 and 8, right? This was not a comparison group. It was just to test, can we give psilocybin? Can we do this treatment? How do people respond? Can they tolerate it? We're like working the kinks out to see how this works. So how did it work? Well, here's the outcomes. Pretty much, it looks really good, right? We have a significant change from the baseline to all the other time points, and from weeks 1 to 4 to all the other time points, except for the only one that I think is not significant is weeks 1 to 4 to weeks 9 to 12. I'm sorry, my pointer is not working. On the heavy drinking days, which reduction of percent heavy drinking days, which is the red line. So from the second dot on the red line to the 4th, that's the only difference on there that's not significant. So pretty good. Just to kind of backtrack a second, though, we're measuring 2 things here. The main outcome measure is reduction in percent heavy drinking days, and then we're also measuring the reduction in overall drinking days. And this is the same for both studies, so I'll explain. We use the timeline follow back, where we sit with people and look at a calendar and have them go back through the days of the last 30 days or 60 days, whatever our time period is, and track how many drinks they've had on each day. And when done right, this is a self-report measure, but when it's done in a supportive way and people are encouraged to share as much as they can and not penalized for sharing that they have actually had alcohol, it's fairly reliable. Many people, I've noticed in the studies, many people actually do start writing down how many drinks they've had on a daily basis, but this is how that information is collected. So again, substantial improvement, no control group on this one, but this is what led to justification for the larger phase 2 trial. What does the therapy look like, though, right? That's a big question. 2 therapists, 2 kinds of therapy. So one is meta or motivational enhancement and taking action therapy. In the pilot study, it was just called MET, and it was slightly less developed than it is now for the phase 2 trial, but it's really essentially the same. It's a motivational interviewing style intervention, and it provides feedback on drinking patterns. So we gather all this data on how much people are drinking, like what percentile they're in, how many drinks per day, what's their average, and we talk to them about that and present that, and ask in a very open manner, like how does this feel to you? Where would you like to go with this? What kinds of changes would you like to make? We do a lot about eliciting values and talking to people about why they would like to make a change. And then we're also incorporating some CBT skills and some really practical behavior change stuff. And then the other therapist is what's doing what's called preparation, support, and integration, which is focusing on preparing for the psychedelic session, what's going to happen during the day, what to expect, how to manage if things feel uncomfortable, and then working to relate that experience back to the changes that the person is going to make. I have some pictures. This is my office. Well, this is where we do the. This isn't. We have other psychotherapy offices, but this is where we actually do the dosing sessions in New York. So it looks much less like a hospital room than a living room, right? And this is actually at Bellevue Hospital. So the room was decorated and arranged and furnished by the team specifically for this purpose. And you're starting to see now, because there's, there are studies going on in other places now, you're starting to see other setups for dosing session rooms in treatment centers and in hospitals. And this was actually one of the earliest ones. It was moved from one building when the group that I work with did a trial for cancer, for end-of-life cancer anxiety, but the room looks very much the same. So you'll see lots of pictures of that couch, like in the papers and the articles. It's pretty famous. Okay, so current study. This is the one that is sort of the star of the show. It's a double-blind trial of psilocybin-assisted treatment for alcohol dependence. It was started at University of New Mexico. First few patients went through there, and then is now only happening at NYU. The N is going to be at least 100 objectives to characterize the effects of psilocybin between 25 and 40 milligrams per 70 kilograms in alcohol-dependent patients versus the control or the placebo, which is diphenhydramine, otherwise known as Benadryl. I don't know, you probably have a different name for it here. But it's an antihistamine, tends to make people feel a little woozy and a little bit off, so maybe they wouldn't be able to tell what they got. But that's the placebo. The idea is that something is happening. We're not quite sure what. And I often get the question that, well, can't you tell? Like, isn't it obvious? No, not always. I mean, sometimes we're pretty sure we're making a guess in one direction or another, but we're quite often not. And sometimes people are unsure too. I'd say most of the people in the study are actually psychedelic naive, so they don't know what to expect, and they may really not know what they've gotten. We have two ancillary studies to mention as well, a neuroimaging study and a qualitative study. Not going to go into too many details about those, but this gives you an overall the study design. People come in, we've got screening, baseline, 4 weeks of therapy, psilocybin session number 1 or diphenhydramine session number 1. And right around that session, there's a pre-session fMRI or post-session fMRI if people have signed up for that optional second study. They go through the rest of the study. They've got follow-up at about 6 months, 36 weeks, and then they can come back for this optional extension phase where everybody in the extension phase definitely gets psilocybin. So everyone in the study gets either 1 or 3 psilocybin sessions. And then there's a third study, another ancillary study that's a qualitative interview study, and that's an option that people can take after they've completed that third session, so that we know that everybody who does the qualitative study has had at least 1 psilocybin session. So here's the data that I have from this study thus far. These are interim findings. This is from 56 people who completed through 12 weeks. And because it's a double-blind study, and there's a control group and an active session group, we're not unblinding them. So we're not just looking and saying, okay, well, these people in this group got the psilocybin, and those people in that group got that, and then, okay, look at the outcomes from each group. What we did instead was look at their scores on something called the mystical experience scale. And the mystical experience scale is designed to identify different aspects of a mystical experience, and people rate it. And the part of the hypothesis of the study is that the stronger the mystical experience, the more likely the person is that they actually had psilocybin, right? Because it's been demonstrated that psilocybin can occasion a mystical experience in a clinical setting. So with the idea that higher MEQ scores are going to correlate probably to psilocybin, we just looked at the strength of those scores and split the group at the median. So out of 56 people, that would be half of them had in the now what's we're calling the high MEQ score range, and half of them in the low MEQ score range, and then looked at drinking outcomes for that group. Did I skip 2? Or did I just skip 1? No, I only skipped 1. Okay. So here's some of the differences, and a couple things to point out here. There wasn't a significant, between splitting it with these two groups this way, we didn't yet see a difference in drinks per heavy drinking day, the number of drinks per heavy drinking day. A heavy drinking day, I believe, is defined as 5 or more drinks. So when people had a day where they drank 5 or more, there wasn't a difference there as far as between the two groups, right? Interestingly, the percent of heavy drinking days, so the percentage of days that people did go to that heavy drinking level, there was a difference in the groups at baseline, and that difference was sustained and maybe even grew a little bit at week 12. This means, okay, so we randomized people. It didn't matter what their percentage of heavy drinking days was when we screened them and we enrolled them. It's just random that at baseline there happened to be a difference. But what I wonder, when I was just looking at this, is the correlation doesn't imply the causation, and vice versa. Could it be that people who were perhaps more primed to have a high mystical experience, or to rate their experience as more highly mystical, just happen to have a pattern of drinking that involved fewer heavy drinking days at onset, at the outset of the study? I don't know. It's an idea. But this again, we'll see what this bears out over time. Here's some really nice outcome data so far from week 12, showing differences in percent drinking days and differences in drinks per drinking day. And then again, this is overall, not just heavy drinking days. So really here we've got you can't really quite see the p-values, but this is a 0.01 difference, p-value being less than 0.01 for week 12 outcomes in the number of drinks per drinking day. The people who had a low MEQ are still averaging up here around 7 or so drinks a day drinks per drinking day, and the people who had the high mystical experience questionnaire are averaging, it looks like, somewhere around 3, right? And that's below threshold for a lot of things. That's below threshold for like what would count as a binge, or what would be getting somebody's blood alcohol likely to a place that they're more at risk, right? This is where the risk goes up at that distinction of heavy drinking days. A couple other measures that are included that are great are the HAM-D and the HAM-A, depression and anxiety scores, and we haven't seen differences here. So even with high mystical experience, we're not seeing significant differences. So this may or may not be correlated to change, but at this point, it doesn't look that way. People could still be anxious. They could still be having the same amount of depression symptoms. And that's not responsible for the change thus far. This one I really like. We do the alcohol craving scale, and we take this measure at week 5, so that's 1 week after that first psilocybin session. And already right there, we're seeing a significant difference in the amount of craving for alcohol that people are experiencing after just one psilocybin session, right? So experientially, what I draw from this is people they're struggling less. They're experiencing less craving to drink. It's not just that they're drinking less, but experientially, things are easier for them right at week 5. So that's 1 week after the first psilocybin session, and it's in reference to like how have your cravings been over the past week. All right. Good so far. I'm going to share a little bit of some participant perspectives so that you can hear more about what people going through this have to say. So I did a qualitative content analysis of 17 debriefing sessions from the pilot study. What that means is the pilot study, the first study that I talked about that's completed, where we had an N of 10 and everybody got psilocybin. There were 17 psilocybin sessions conducted in that study. There were 3 people who did not take the second psilocybin session. And we looked at the debriefing sessions, which is the session, the psychotherapy session that happens the day after, right? The day after that, that main psilocybin session. I had some great collaboration on this with my PI at NYU, as well as another researcher, Derek May at Hopkins, who worked on gathering all those transcripts, gathering all those recordings, getting all those recordings transcribed by a very generous group of graduate students, generous with their time, and got that data to me, and we all kind of worked on it together, and I did a lot of the analysis here. So I want to share a couple of things. Just talking about how do people conceptualize this? Like, what kinds of things do patients say? So the mystical experience includes things like internal and external unity, feelings of interconnectedness, the feeling of not being able to describe what happened, even though people do use words to describe it usually, often quite a lot, but there's this feeling that it's sort of beyond words. I want to read you a couple of things. These all came from people who had, there were 3 sessions in which people really met the bar of what we define as like a complete or full mystical experience. One person said, it was just this feeling of oneness. It was really this freedom of knowing, I felt peaceful. I felt more invigorated. There's a transcendence of time and space that can occur. So people said things like, it was like infinity. Everything was a sense of infinity. I was going in and out of it. I was in the middle of it. It was all this space. And ineffability, we had one participant who said, a painting's going to explain it better than words. Just my personality. I have a hard time putting spiritual. I mean, it was spiritual for me, for sure. So that's a little bit of that. The concept of ego dissolution is often that people describe it as a sense of like losing a sense of self or losing their self-referential thinking, and it's related to changes in the default mode network that can occur during as a result of psilocybin ingestion. So here's a really nice quote that I think describes that. One of the participants said, there was a part where I felt gone. It wasn't like that last time where I always remembered I was Adam. There was a part where I was gone. I would come back, you know, telling myself, you took this to try to help, and it is helping. There's the old Adam and the new Adam without alcohol. One other participant said, I was breaking up into little droplets of water and then coming whole again. It was really pretty. We also looked at, people were asked to describe the experience in relation to alcohol and what they thought it might mean for their alcohol use or their drinking. And so everybody was asked that question, and pretty much all the interviews contained some content about it. But one of the participants said, I had a series of, you did this, look at this and this and this with the liquor. Then I saw this long tunnel, and I was expecting to see a light, but it didn't quite happen. I didn't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I did see like chains, and the significance to me was that I was in bondage by the alcohol. So this is somebody's experience and vision from their psilocybin experience. It's very powerful. The MET therapist or the meta therapist is trained to elicit change talk and help people describe their own reasons for change, and then help people verbalize their commitment to change. So we looked at both of those things. People said things like, I feel pretty confident. I feel more confident saying you don't have to pass me the drinks. I don't feel guilty about that where I typically would about turning down alcohol. I can change this right now, today, in this moment. I feel more positive about not being, about being able to not drink. Those are really expressions of increased motivation. And then commitment to change is more commitment language. I will do this. So people said some things like, I'm going to do something different. If those urges come up, I plan on fighting them. I want to serve my purpose. I want to find my mission. I want to do it right. I'll do the best I can. I will do my best not to fan the fires. I like that one. And the other thing we looked at was dysphoric experiences and their resolution. So dysphoric experiences, we educate people in the psychoeducation portion of the preparation therapy, are a potential experience that one might have. We work with people to learn interpersonal grounding and breathing for grounding, and encourage people to reach out to us for support if that's needed. But it's not entirely uncommon to have a dysphoric or difficult portion of the experience. One person said, there was some darkness involved in some of it, but I could understand through the darkness that I wasn't alone. Another one said, I was having a hard time and I was crying, and that's when my grandma was calling me and rocking me and singing to me. So that brought up a lot of emotions. Just some more outcomes from that study. When we did this paper, we did a little bit more extra analysis, because you should always do extra analysis, right? And just analyze things. There were a lot of numbers, so we sifted through them, and I just wanted to show this, not because I want to get too deeply into it, but I wanted to show the reduction in percent heavy drinking days. Like you saw before the overall numbers, those were averages for everybody. There were actually 4 people that had 100% reduction in heavy drinking days, so they had no more heavy drinking days. From whatever they came in with to the end, it was the heavy drinking days were 100% gone. That doesn't mean they weren't drinking at all. It means they had no heavy drinking days left. Other people reduced them by a little bit, 9.21%, or a lot, like 72%, right? So those are the kinds of variations that we got. But everybody did reduce them, and that sort of exemplifies the numbers that we saw up there before. Another interesting thing here is that everybody, you can see everybody got, well, this is written differently than I had it before, but this is 0.3 milligrams per kilo, which is equal to 30 milligrams per 70 kilos. And people who did not have a complete mystical experience, which means meeting that 0.6 cutoff on the MEQ after the first dose, they had the option to go up to 40 milligrams per 70 kilos for the second dose. So everybody did that except for the second person on our list. These are all pseudonyms, by the way. That's in the paper. The second person on our roster who did meet that score at the first session, and he did not have to go up. He did not go up for the second session, and he also achieved 100% reduction in heavy drinking days. And it's a similar way that it's done for the current study, except our starting dose is 25 milligrams per 70 kilos, and it can go up to either 30 or 40, depending on how one does with that first session, right? Another little shot of our session room. That's actually Michael Bogenschutz right there, and 2 of our administrative and very helpful staff and people at NYU that contributed to putting this together. So I wanted to show them. But basically, this is what the session looks like. We have a nice room. We have a heart rate monitor. We're taking blood pressure regularly. And monitoring people for any kind of emergency or difficult situation. Although I think the main and really the leading intervention and way of managing anything is just our presence and support, the preparation that we do, and our accompanying the person while they're there. So why might this work? this is a good place to kind of get a little bit creative. We know that psilocybin can occasion a mystical experience in the lab, and we know that many traditional treatment models and treatment programs really focus on that as being something that's essential, if not curative or necessary for a recovery from addictive behavior. So that's really going back to the 12-step model, and is consistently cited in the literature as something that's important and necessary, right? There can also be a huge contribution from psychological factors such as increased self-efficacy, motivation, insight, acceptance, compassion, especially self-compassion, and new perspective. So for instance, seeing oneself in relation to alcohol in a new way, seeing oneself in relation to other people in a new way, and all of those things. And these are not mutually exclusive at all, but those sort of psychological factors that we're looking at and measuring, as well as, for instance, potentially reductions in anxiety or depression, those kinds of things. And then the physiological mechanisms, receptor modulation, increased neuroplasticity, new connections. Our neuroimaging study may show quite a lot towards helping us understand who's responding to this, how they're responding to it, and why. Right? So stay tuned, because when this is finished and completely published, I believe we'll be able to say a lot more about what the mechanisms of action potentially are based on the results, when we can actually divide people by the groups and say, here's who actually got the psilocybin and here's who didn't. The way that it's done here, we don't know, but we are just looking at the relationship between the mystical experience and the outcomes. So what does the future hold? Well, let's see. The current project is expected to finish enrollment by the end of 2019. Thanks to recent publications and increased awareness by the general public, we're getting a lot more calls than we used to. So we're actively enrolling and screening people for the study. If you are in New York, you know anybody in New York who wants to apply, let us know. People are finding us more rapidly than they used to, so that's great. And there's already good evidence for psilocybin-assisted treatment for smoking cessation, and there's a study of psilocybin-assisted treatment for cocaine use going on. That's at University of Alabama. Smoking cessation is complete. It was done at Hopkins. They had somewhere around an 80% quit rate, and that's substantially more significantly better than most of the traditional and already approved treatments. So those are other indications, and I believe that there will hopefully be more work with those as well. There should be a follow-up to this, which would be a larger phase 3, again, double-blind, randomized controlled trial, but probably multi-site, and with other kinds of controls to be able to expand this and to be able to say, does this work in other places? Maybe, who knows, like maybe it only works in New York. I don't know, like that's why we multi-site trials, right? Maybe it only works with an urban population. Maybe, we need to do it in other cities and other places and other languages and see if it translates, right? If it holds when it gets expanded to different pools of people. The other thing about doing phase 3 trials that's really important is that usually when you move from a smaller phase 2 trial to a larger phase 3 trial, you're also going from having, what we currently have, 5 or 6 therapists doing all the treatment for the participants to 50 or 60 at different sites, right? So maybe it's just us, like maybe it's just the 5 of us or 6 of us now that work on this study, and if we try to teach other people how to do this, it's something that's not going to really be translatable or teachable to other therapists. So that's a huge factor actually in scaling up these kinds of treatments and making them available to others. A couple of challenges I want to mention as we go forward. FDA, US, EMA, Europe approval requires multiple large-scale studies. It usually requires several hundred patients, multiple sites, a lot of resources. Treating somebody with this treatment in a research setting is substantially more expensive than it would be if it was available and approved, or maybe potentially will be when it's available and approved, and you can walk into a regular medical clinic or psychotherapy clinic and get the treatment. It's exponentially more expensive because of all the regulations, all the documentation, all the extra security, all the extra time that has to go into doing all of that, space constraints and those sorts of things. Also, by and large, all the funding has been from private donations and foundations and things like that, and that is a restriction, right? If there isn't a funding source that's able to come up with several millions of dollars to run studies like this, that keeps them from actually happening. Because the regulations are so strict, it takes extra time. There's extra approvals. For instance, in New York, in order to have psilocybin as a Schedule I drug, in order to have one for a study, we have to have a safe, we have to have combinations and deadbolts and security alarms, 2 of them. We have to have a monitoring plan, all of this work that goes into it. And once all that stuff gets installed, we have to apply to the state for permission. Once we get state permission with an on-site inspection, we then have to apply to the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. All of that can take 6 months. Meanwhile, we're renting a space, we're waiting, we're watching. But that process we have to go through for every study. So even if our site has permission for one study and one drug, we have to go through the process again for each study that gets started. So that's a challenge because of the resources that are needed to be able to do that. Breakthrough status for psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression was special status that the FDA granted. I think it was back in October or November. It was late last year. And so that kind of status or approval for another indication could potentially help break down some of these barriers, make it easier to do research, make it potentially less expensive and research more accessible to do. But right now, psilocybin is not approved treatment for anything, and it's in the most restrictive class of drugs, and that in turn makes it challenging. So, want to give thanks to the whole NYU team, Michael Bogenschutz, the PI, and everybody else, my co-therapists, Jeff, Steve, especially Sarah Menenga, who helped me get these slides. Got these slides to me very recently with like the most updated data we could possibly have. A couple other people, the people that worked on the original UNM team, who did the pilot study, and the first couple of participants in the larger phase 2 trial. Our funders, DSMB is Data Safety Monitoring Board, some people that contribute their time to making sure that our data is all well cared for. Hoffer Research, which again funded the trial, and USONA that provided the psilocybin. And let's do some Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take the opportunity to start us off with 2 questions, actually.
Okay.
And then I will run around with the mic for you guys. So my first question is on accessibility. Mm-hmm. I got really hopeful when you were talking here at the end about the future, but there is at the same time a worry in me that we will go sort of in the same direction as the pharmaceutical industry. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a great question, and there's certainly concern about that in the field, and I think that's a really valid place to be aware of and thinking about ahead of time. So I'll say a couple things. First of all, your health system here looks different than ours in the United States. So ours is most people their health care is covered by private insurers. And those private insurers can decide, if something is an FDA-approved treatment, they have to cover it, but they don't need to cover things that are off-label or not FDA-approved. So what we think, and I'll just kind of speak broadly about psychedelic assisted therapy and treatments, because to pick it apart for different drugs and diagnoses would be probably way too complex. But it looks like what will happen there is once there is FDA approval, the private insurers will start to look at the cost of the treatment versus the cost of not providing the treatment. Because if somebody is a private insurer, they want to look at, for instance, how many hospital visits are people with this diagnosis making, how many inpatient hospitalizations, healthcare utilization rates for this population. I know more about that with respect to the MDMA work for PTSD, but in the PTSD study, for the sake of this, that those kinds of things are documented so that we can show whether or not there was a reduction there. And I think that what'll happen is that, it is a sort of capitalist healthcare system that we have, but that this will make sense economically, and therefore be covered. The main expense in any of these kinds of psychedelic assisted therapies is the therapy, the therapist's time, the therapist's training, and all of that. And I think that probably our biggest fight is going to be really to preserve that and to continue to advocate for it. But as long as we can maintain the quality that we're seeing now, it won't make a lot of sense to not do this if it's approved. Here, and in most of Europe where you have national healthcare systems, I think that that's going to be even clearer, right? Because you're using taxpayer money. It can be seen as, it's more likely to be seen as a public health concern. So I'm hopeful for that. I mean, the drugs themselves are not, they're not expensive. There's a large, usually initial investment to make, but as far as like the percentage of the cost of what this will cost, the bulk of it is really going to be the therapist time. I'd say, at least 90% of the cost is going to be therapist time. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Second question, a little unrelated.
Nothing's unrelated.
You have a background in addiction psychology, and you also have experience working with MDMA as a therapist.
Yes.
And MDMA seems really promising for PTSD, but there's also an ongoing study in Bristol in the UK with MDMA for alcohol use disorder.
Yes, Bensessa.
Bensessa, exactly. What do you think of the potential of MDMA to treat alcohol use disorder compared to psilocybin?
I think it's got great potential, or Ben wouldn't be doing it. I trust his judgment and intuition on that, and his justifications. Ben he's a trauma therapist, and he has I think an excellent understanding of the mechanisms behind that. And from what I understand, the idea is that alcohol use in many cases is a manifestation of some kind of trauma, maybe not diagnosable PTSD, but perhaps attachment trauma, relational trauma, early childhood trauma, things like that, and that you may be focusing on that diagnosis, but you may actually be kind of getting to the root of it, because you're using something that's actually helping to heal the trauma as well. So, yeah, I'm really excited for that study, and I can't wait to hear him talk about it every time I get the chance.
Yeah, and it makes me dream of comparative studies in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, there could be comparative studies, there can be other kinds of studies. One thing that Ben isn't doing this, but we're generally not doing it all, that I think will be a great way that this research will get expanded, is to be able to do group administration, simultaneous administration of psilocybin. There's only one study going on in the U.S. that's doing that as a treatment indication, and it's something that definitely, if we're concerned about cost and therapist time and the cost of having therapists available, right now it's 2 for each one patient, all of these hours of time. that's another way that cost effectiveness can be addressed. And I think it can be done effectively. So.
Awesome. Thank you. So do we have any questions from the audience? We have one back there. I want to just remind you all to please keep it short and make sure that there's actually a question to Elizabeth.
I might not be able to answer it, but if it's a question, that's the start.
You go. Please speak closely in the mic.
Yes. All right. From what I understood about the therapeutic sessions with MDMA is that the therapist is very much involved, and it's more like the MDMA is used as an enhancer to a therapeutical session. But could you tell me like differences in how the therapeutical session looks like with psilocybin and MDMA?
Yeah, this is going to be entirely anecdotal and like my personal observations only, not quantifiable. But I think that when people have a psilocybin session where they're really immersed in a mystical experience, they will tend to kind of go. We use eye shades and headphones in both studies to help people block out extra stimulation and sort of intensify their experience. I think that when people at the psilocybin study are really in that experience, and it is more of a full experience, they don't tend to be too interactive during that. It can feel really hard to form words, and it can feel really hard to like even put a sentence together and vocalize anything, right? But not everybody gets to that point, and not everybody stays at that point for the whole time. So we may be more interactive and more talking with them. They may be experiencing more interpersonal insights, more emotions coming up, things that they really need to express. And at that point, we're very much interacting with them if they need that. And we'll also ask them or encourage them if they'd like to kind of go back in and explore their internal experience. But that's kind of how I see those sessions. The MDMA sessions also tend to kind of go back and forth between an inner experience and a dialogue, a conversant dialogue. And we will, if people have been talking a whole lot, invite them to go back to their inner experience, or maybe if they've been in an inner experience, invite them to see if they'd want to share. But it's probably less likely that somebody would be like immersed in such an inner experience that it would feel like they're really not connected enough to tell us like what's going on so much. They might not want to because they're just in it, but it's a little bit different like that. And you know, both start and probably end with a fair amount of check-in about, you know, how people are doing, what's their mental status, anything we really need to know about, that kind of stuff. So, does that answer it?
So clarification is that your psilocybin treatment session is more like an interaction with patients, is more supportive during the session rather than therapeutic?
Probably in that direction. Yeah, unless the person, it's really like they're in distress and they need to talk about it, or they're experiencing some paranoia or some really difficult emotion, and they kind of need us to help them like get a little bit more grounded, that kind of stuff. I should mention that in the psilocybin studies, pretty much all the psilocybin studies that have been done in the modern era, there has always been, I think, always been on hand some what we call rescue meds, which are either benzodiazepine and an antipsychotic in the room, just in case the person has a unmanageable amount of anxiety or becomes just so distressed and disoriented that they're not responsive to the psychosocial support of the therapist, and those have never been needed in the modern era of research. So.
All right.
Sure, yeah.
Answering to the previous question, you referred to the headphones as a mostly cutting off or lowering external influences. My question was about the musical guidance. is it used, and what kind of it? How maybe there are specific playlists accessible?
Yes. So the music for the psilocybin session, the psilocybin alcohol trial, is one set playlist that everybody gets, and it's the same for all the sessions for all the participants. It includes a lot of ambient music, nothing with any words. It includes some Brian Eno and some Philip Glass and some sort of soundtrack music. It's designed to be evocative, but not specifically of anything. So music that can kind of help people move through experiences, but not like indicate what experience they should have. And it does sort of follow hopefully the trajectory of the psilocybin, so a bit of a more intensifying over the first hour or so, and get fairly energetic, and then sort of mellow out towards the end of the day. The MDMA study, therapists can actually choose their own music, and so that's great because we get some variety. I have heard that psilocybin playlist, I think, a total of 22 times now, which is a lot. 3 times people are okay with. But we can actually vary the music. So we start out with some similar rules apply. We want everything to be no words or anything that's like very specifically recognizable. But we can build a playlist ourselves. And what I've done often is start with a playlist that I or one of my colleagues has made that seems about right, and then get a little feedback on it and say, were there things that we could do to improve it? For instance, if somebody really felt a lot of anxiety during the first hour or so, we might go with something even calmer. Or if somebody felt like they wanted, just a more intense or upbeat experience, we can manipulate that a little bit. We can also change it in real time if needed.
So what was really behind my question was, what's your take on the study? You probably know it was published last year by Imperial College with the conclusion that it was in the case of depression that the outcomes are mostly predictive depending on response to the music, not on the drug intensity.
Yeah, that's why the playlist is a set playlist. For the psilocybin study, and of the upcoming psilocybin studies that I'm aware of, it's going to be a set playlist. The MDMA study, we're varying it, and I don't know that finding would hold for the MDMA work, but yeah, it's consistent with that. But yeah, hopefully we'll find out more. And there is in the alcohol trial, there is a questionnaire about people's response to the music, so there will be some data on that. Yeah, there will be some data on that. I didn't bring it, but if it's not in the main paper, I'll some of us will write a follow-up because that is really a great topic. It's on the radar. So.
Okay, next question.
I was just interested to know if you could tell more about the history of psilocybin, and also another question about what was there certain events that led to it ended up being prohibited.
Well, so a history of psilocybin, I mean, it's a naturally occurring compound. It occurs in psilocybin mushrooms that grow mostly in tropical climates and in the Northwest as well. And it was initially came to the attention of Western medicine through a mycologist by the name of Gordon Wasson, who wrote an article for Life magazine in the late 1956 maybe? I can't remember the year, but it was the 50s. And he was very interested in what he'd heard about the possibility of these hallucinogenic mushrooms. He went to Mexico. He met with a curandera there, Maria Sabina. Unfortunately revealed her identity to the detriment of her life and health and community, of her well-being and community. But that's where things really came to the attention of Western science, and he sent a sample of psilocybin mushrooms to Albert Hofmann, who extracted psilocybin. He figured it's probably something similar to LSD, except naturally occurring. Extracted psilocybin and later developed a method for synthesizing it. So synthetic psilocybin's been on the scene since the probably early 60s. And as far as how did it become prohibited, it was it was in the blanket sweeping regulations that were enacted in the late 60s and 1970. It was just included in the class of drugs, and because of its similarity to more notorious drugs like LSD, included in that scheduling system. Yeah. Is that good? Anything else? Okay.
Thank you for your fascinating research and presentation. I have a question that comes from my absolutely amateur understanding of the subject, so sorry if I say something fluffy or dumb. But so how I understand it is that addiction is a bad habit that is seen as a coping mechanism, as a solution to the distress caused by a trauma. Now, this childhood trauma is a new buzzword in self-development. And what I wanted to understand better is the difference between solving the addiction and solving the origin of the addiction, if this model applies at all, and what these substances are actually doing. Because something that I'm thinking is if you solve addiction to alcohol, but then that transforms into addiction to eating, or just addiction to nothing, but there's still the distress from the root cause still there. So understanding a little bit better that.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. There is often a link. There's often a link, and I think one of the great failings of our system is that we try to treat addiction separately and in isolation from trauma and other mental health struggles, and it's not. We can't see it that way. In a way, yes, psilocybin-assisted for alcohol use disorder is an approach to treating the symptom, the alcoholism as a symptom. But I think that where it goes past other treatments is that it gives people something that applies way beyond just stopping drinking. So these experiences of insights, interconnectedness, the mystical experience, whatever that is, that permeates the person's whole life. They're then able to make changes with drinking, but they're also having insights about their interpersonal relationships, about their childhood, about the way that they relate to themselves. And my hope is that extends to like overall better mental health and not just the changes in drinking, although that is what we're focused on. And like Philip brought up, the trial that Ben is doing with alcohol, MDMA for alcohol, may show us more about where that overlap is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I would like to hear about your opinions about pros and cons when enrolling patients, whether they have previous psychedelic experiences, or maybe if it should even be an exclusion criteria if you're not psychedelic naive.
Is there can you take the mic back? Is there a question behind that? Like, is there something question behind the question? Because I can answer it straightforward, but it sounds like there's
no. I'm in research myself, and I'm interested in conducting experiments in the future. So just thinking about for the for the setup for
your research design.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. Well, please do some research on this because it's needed. So by and large, the studies don't rule people out for, and this is, again, very general, not speaking about any studies specifically, but by and large, people are not ruled out for any psychedelic history, use of psychedelics in their history, but extensive use would probably be, most studies would probably be considered a counterindication, just because it could be a potential confound, right? It's interesting, you know, the earliest study that was done in the U.S. in this sort of modern era of research was a clinical study with humans was Rick Strassman's work with DMT, also at UNM, where he did a dose response study where he gave IV DMT to people, and one of the one of the caveats to that, the only ways he could get it approved was by promising that he wouldn't give DMT to anybody who hadn't already had DMT, because the regulators were really concerned about him like introducing people to a new drug of abuse. So the precedent was working with people who had psychedelic experience. Now, to the extent to which their experiences are different because they're second, third, fourth, fifth experiences versus first experiences, I don't think that's completely quantified. But I would say that in the current studies, most of the ones that I work in, a large portion of people don't have psychedelic experience prior to this. They're coming in psychedelic naive. What are the differences? They may be a little bit more anxious about it, but they also may be a little more open to it because they might not have a pre-existing idea of what to expect. So I think that's going to affect different people differently. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, my question is about adverse effects, difficult experiences, or even undesirable outcomes. How frequent are these, and how severe? And did anyone start drinking more, for example?
Well, again, there certainly have been people that have been unable to continue in the study or have continued drinking in a problematic way. But we don't know, it's still a double-blind study, so we don't know what condition they got. And that's something that I think you'll need to wait until the full data is out with the two groups to see. As far as adverse events, it's not uncommon for people to have a headache. It's fairly uncommon, but it can happen that people have some nausea. But psilocybin is incredibly safe as far as the toxicity of it. So the real potential for adverse or difficult events is the psychological perspective. Unlike when people may take psychedelics in other settings, they're in the room with two therapists that they've built a relationship with, and that really goes a long way. We're trained and we're actually, have skilled in developing enough of a relationship with that person that they can trust us with what's going on, and we can assist them through a lot of what's going on. So I would be really concerned about adverse events, psychological adverse events, much more so in a setting where there might not be that much therapeutic relationship and rapport and trust. But if we don't feel that we have that with a participant, we don't proceed. So we have to feel confident that our relationship with that person is enough that we're going to be able to support them through what's going to happen, if that explains it. As far as like in the study, nobody's had to be admitted to the psychiatric hospital. We haven't had any use of any of our rescue meds. We haven't had any. That stuff has not been hasn't been happening. We're prepared for it should it be necessary, but it's not what we're seeing. We're seeing people. By and large, it's the end of the day, it's 5 o'clock, their friend or their spouse comes to pick them up, they go home, they have dinner, they do a little journaling, and they come back the next morning feeling just fine. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for a great presentation. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about your experiences, if you've had any with regulators of different kind or legislators on a federal level or state level, and any concerns they might have, and any obstacles you've encountered.
That's a big one. I don't usually directly interact with regulators or legislators, but I would really encourage you to look at the MAPS website. They do a lot of work directly with legislation and regulation and that kind of stuff. My sense is that, the people who do the local inspections and come and give us the certificates and all of that documentation are perfectly fine with what we're doing. They're just doing their job, which is to come and inspect everything and make sure that the safe is the safe and everything, and they may not even really know what psilocybin is. Or it's certainly not being held up because it's psilocybin, because it's a psychedelic. We're not getting that at all. The FDA has been, completely, up to doing what they're supposed to do, doing things, returning protocols, and completing the processes in a timely manner. So there don't seem to be any real ideological or problems that are keeping this from going through the process. It's just a really complicated process. There are some efforts in certain cities and states in the US to either decriminalize psilocybin or make it available in those ways, and that's sort of a different avenue and a whole different line of work that I'm not going to go into now, but if you're interested, definitely look up the decriminalization approach as opposed to the medical, put it through the medical system approach, because that's two different ways of getting, two different outcomes, but two different things that are going on sort of simultaneously. But, yeah. Okay, we do one more? Thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, two small questions. When it comes to the mystical experiences and the lack of mystical experiences, the people who did not have mystical experiences, did they have some kind of results anyway? And also the second question is, I'm curious if the people who were in the study have some other psychological, psychiatric disorders except for?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. So when people come into the study, they're given standardized diagnostic assessments, and most major psychiatric disorders that could be a confound or could make it difficult to tell what's being affected and how things are working are going to be ruled out, right? Because we're isolating alcohol problems. So that helps us get a clear signal on how this works for alcohol, but it also may reduce the applicability, which is why a larger study is definitely needed, right? Because we don't see this so much in isolation in the community. However, for people who, the part of the reason I like the way the study is designed is that everybody gets some really good treatment, and then what we're really testing is the additive effect of the psilocybin, right? So everybody's getting, I guess 7 or 8 sessions of motivational enhancement therapy, the time with the therapists, the time to talk about their experience, even just the process of coming in and documenting all this stuff, and that's stuff that is already evidence-based treatment. It's already shown to work and to be helpful. So what's probably going to look like is everybody improves, and then there's a difference in improvement. Both groups, should theoretically improve, and thus far that's consistent. Yeah, sure. Because the people who had the psilocybin but didn't have a mystical experience. Well, we couldn't tell from this because this is just looking at people who had a higher versus a lower mystical experience. So that I think is going to have to be something to look at from the when the full data comes out. But I think there's a lot of, as a therapist, I think there's a lot of really valuable things that can happen for people who have a psilocybin session in the context of therapy and not necessarily a full mystical experience, right? They can have interpersonal insights, they can have emotional insights, they can just even going through the process of confronting some of their fears about having the session, that stuff can be really valuable. So from the therapist's chair, yeah, I think there's a lot of valuable stuff that comes out there. Whether or not that's going to bear out as something that's measurable in terms of the outcomes that we're looking at, I couldn't tell you yet. But, yeah, one of our main principles in all psychedelic therapy is to say that we kind of treat everything that comes up and everything that happens as important to the person, important for the person, relevant to why they're there. And it's not about assigning values to having the right experience, but to be open and allow whatever experience comes. So, yeah.
So we have a lot of really good questions. At the same time, I want to be conscious of the energy level in the room and not push further than we can all take. So I have actually 6 more questions lined up, but after that we'll cap it. Then Elizabeth will stay for a little while, and then we'll move on to the pub to keep the discussion going. So there will be more time for questions. Okay. So how do we feel about that? Yeah.
Good? Yeah, because there's a couple of people I see hands.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had another question about potential adverse effects, and especially long range on a bigger time scale. For example, I think that there was a study on DMT back in the days when they had to have they had to create a therapy group afterwards. And that study wasn't created very well, I think, but it was they had to like create like a therapy group afterwards because they had to like talk about these very profound experiences which had a big impact on the life. And also I was considering there is some evidence of about that they would raise the creativity level of the participants and the big psychedelic experiences, especially with psilocybin. At least I've seen one study on it. And there is also a big connection between. There is claimed to be a connection between creativity and depression and especially anxiety. Like there have been some adversaries for what, not adversaries, but people who think that it should be considered a diagnosis with like too high level of creativity or whatever. And I don't know, is those long range, are there being studies done on the long range experience in perhaps like recreational use?
Yeah, we don't have, I mean, there's not enough people and it hasn't been long enough to really go into long range outcomes, but as far as health outcomes, we don't expect anything negative because we know that psilocybin and similar compounds have been used in ritual use and ceremonial use by people regularly every week or 2 weeks for years on end throughout their entire lifetime, and we're not seeing negative health consequences from that. So there's no reason to think that a couple of sessions in a clinical treatment room are going to do some long-term, have some long-term problems. As far as support, I think that's one of the most important things people can have. It can be very complicated for a study to provide long-term support, so that's one of the reasons that in my private work I'm working to train clinicians so that when somebody finishes participating in a study, we can actually refer them to a therapist who's educated about this, because there aren't that many. So we're working to address that as well. Yeah. Thanks.
Hello, Elizabeth. Great to see you back in Sweden.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is kind of a perfect segue into my question, because it was just about whether there is any work done on sort of connecting the participants with each other afterwards so they can sort of help themselves in group, on forums digitally or meetups.
Yeah, people have found each other, but again, for privacy reasons and safety reasons, by and large, that cannot come through the study or the sponsor of the study.
Not even like opt-in, like would you like to be able to be contacted afterwards by someone?
It's really tricky.
Okay.
It's not something we haven't thought about and talked about and considered, but there are a lot of legal and ethical concerns, regulatory concerns, safety concerns about that. So, by and large, that is, that is happening when people find each other through other avenues, and I think that's happening more and more because people come to conferences, people form groups, people meet each other, but and the more people there are, the more they'll find each other. But yeah, it's happening in the.
Have you had any talks or connections like with sort of local AA groups and so on and so forth? Like they often have a very anti sort of drug culture. But I mean, have you had that like locally around where you work?
Have I had talks with
or
them?
like yeah, have you ever been asked to present like the research for like the local AA sort of association or something like that?
No, not at this time. Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that means that there isn't interest. I think it's just we're not, we're presenting in our own forums, and hopefully word is getting out. So, yeah. The next one.
I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the training, background, unique skills of the therapists involved in this work, and related to that also, any risks or opportunities you see in terms of scaling up this kind of treatment?
Yeah, great point. So the therapists that are involved now, most are people who generally have a longer history with this, and that it's sort of a main thing that we're really been pursuing, most of us, for many years. Training usually includes things like didactic sessions, educational sessions, role plays, mock sessions, and supervision is really important. So in some studies, sessions are recorded, in video recorded. Some sessions are only audio recorded, but we're always getting supervision on that. And then they'll do booster sessions and fidelity monitoring and that stuff to the manual. When it gets scaled up, I think we're going to be seeing people that are interested in coming into this at a different point in their lives, and maybe for, with a different kind of background. And I think that the training models are going to need to be scaled up really, really carefully. And likely what's going to happen is that those of us that started 4 or 5 years ago or something are going to be able to move hopefully into doing more mentoring and teaching and helping people come into this work in a way that sustains the quality that we've established. I have to say it's a strong community, which is great. People know each other. There's a good sense of connection among the community. And to me, that's one thing that makes this possible. So that's definitely something that I'll have my eye on, like how can we grow and also preserve that sense. Yeah. Thanks.
I was wondering, did you say there was no reduction in symptoms of depression and anxiety in your study?
Not that we saw from the data that I have, which is this interim analysis at 12 weeks.
Yeah.
It might show up later. It might show up when we actually divide people by control and placebo group.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea why?
Well,
see any reduction of those symptoms?
I mean, I just think that we're not seeing a change in that at this point, is all I can say. That doesn't mean that it's not there or that we won't see it at some point. But keep in mind that these are people that are, the key diagnosis and the focus that we're looking to change is the alcohol use. It's not a study of treatment of depression or treatment of anxiety. So it may not show up, but thus far we haven't seen it. We're not seeing it.
Last question.
Oh, wow, I'm privileged. It's always a problem with therapy is how do you know if you succeed? What are the criteria for success? So someone asked you about long-term follow-ups, and I would hope that you would try, even if it's a small number, that you would try to follow up on a little longer basis because, things might change.
Yeah.
In the long run. That's the one thing, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that this phase 2 trial was designed, it's given a 6-month follow-up, which is substantial. I mean, the first pilot study, I think, was only a 2-month follow-up. This is a 6-month follow-up. And I hope that when there's a phase 3 trial, there will be a even longer follow-up or an extension study that does a longer follow-up. I can say that the PTSD work that I do, I think it's a 6-week follow-up, and then there's an extension 1-year follow-up. But I think it's super important. One of the big barriers to doing that is funding, because it's complicated to keep track of people and keep staffing things and keep all these. You have to keep the study open. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying, if anybody wants to donate a bunch of money to make something like that happen, specifically for that, I'm sure that there's interest and need, but it's always a balancing act as far as what data do we need to get approval and what can we afford to do, and there's always going to be that juggling act. One of the things I like about the study is it is actually 6-month follow-up, and that the PTSD work is a whole year follow-up. But the longer the better, sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Even longer. But the other question, very shortly, is that you're using the number to treat, and the basis is that they don't have heavy drinking sessions. But we know that people can have other things that compensate. They stop drinking. Someone was interested, they start eating or something like that. Sure. But it could also be things that are less drastic, such as not being able to take care of themselves, breaking up of their relationships, social relationships. Could be even worse, going to prison. So I think you really need some more criteria than just.
Oh yeah, the number needed to treat is it's a necessarily oversimplified indicator. And it's just one way of comparing different treatments. There's a lot that it doesn't say, but it is considered an important indicator, and it is considered something of value, especially when you want to compare treatments that look so different as LSD and naltrexone. It's certainly not capturing everything, and we, maybe one day there will be a full comparison study with different arms that are comparing psychedelic treatment to some of these other already approved treatments. But yeah, no, I appreciate that, because it's limited, but it's what's it's the thing that each of these has that we can actually look to. They didn't do mystical experience questionnaires when they treated people with naltrexone. So we can't compare that data. Yeah.
So that is a wrap. Thanks everyone for coming out. If you want to stick around and get to know other people interested in this, please do. Elizabeth will be around as well. I also want to take the opportunity to plug Nätverket för psykedelisk vetenskap. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member. It's 300 crowns for the year, or 200 if you are a student. The membership fees goes to things like this, paying for airfares for researchers and getting the word out. We'll be doing lots of things this year, so please keep an eye on our Facebook page and our homepage, and you will be in the loop.
Thank you.
That's it.